Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final Seeker session of 2019. Today, we're going to be talking about endings and beginnings and taking heart from the unknown. We want to look at what it means to release attachment to the past and to stand as fully and consciously as possible in the present moment. How can we learn to do this without regret and actually take heart from the fact, the blessed fact, that all things come to an end? How can we attune ourselves to the fact that every moment of every day is an ending and a beginning? The true value, in my opinion, of marking the new year is that it reminds us to reckon with the passage of time and the perennial cycles of existence. The question is, how can we use these reckoning moments to renew our commitment to appreciating impermanence? To begin with, it calls for a kind of innocence, a willingness to be more childlike, not childish, not immature, ignorant, willful, juvenile, but childlike in our wondering, our willingness to remain beginners. Such innocence requires the grown up knowledge of how little we actually know, and learning to see this unknowingness as a benefit rather than a handicap. It's the practiced innocence of the wise. As Marilyn Robinson put it in her novel Gilead, quote, there is a learned innocence that is as much to be valued as the innocence of children, unquote. There's a learned innocence that is as much to be valued as the innocence of children. Learned innocence doesn't deny the pain of life, but instead it allows us to be present with what is without trying to control it. Spiritual innocence perceives every moment as an end and a beginning, and it knows that growth can't happen without that cycle. The word innocence comes from the Latin for doing no evil or engaging in any moral wrong. In spiritual terms, what this means is not distorting the present moment with our fear driven thoughts and expectations. Innocence that's founded on spiritual wisdom creates sacredness, and it allows a person to stand like a mountain as the winds of change blow around them. It allows one to live with impermanence without losing heart, because pain, we realize, is actually a dynamic power. Pain is a dynamic, living power that frees the heart even as it's breaking. This creates an emotional state that's hard to describe. It's like grieving and rejoicing in the same moment. It's like being destroyed and recreated at the same time. That's what it feels like to be alive. Spiritual innocence acknowledges loss and breaks the grip of this terrified ego that's determined to hold on to what can't be saved. Now, such innocence is really the goal of spiritual life, resurrecting the view of the wise child. The English mystic Lewis Thompson, who wrote an incredible book, actually, it was compiled after his death from note cards, index cards in a box, called Mirror to the Light, that if you haven't read, I highly, highly recommend it. Anyway, Lewis Thompson explains this very beautifully. He says, quote, the ever new magical universe is continually reborn in the child. Only the grown up was banished from Eden. The child eats of the tree of life. For him, the laws of the universe are magical. This childhood and this magic the Christ restores. Now, Thompson is using Christ here to mean the divine aspect of the human being. This call to spiritual innocence is echoed throughout all of the mystic traditions. After the Buddha's enlightenment, it's said that he entered the kingdom of primal wonder and innocence. The early Greek mystic Heraclitus believed that the kingdom is the child, which of course echoes Jesus's pronouncement that unless you become as little children, you cannot enter again the kingdom of heaven. The Indian sages Ramakrishna and Ramana Maharshi tell us again and again that the nature of God is childlike, and that the realized being, the enlightened individual, is like a child at peace in the womb of the mother. The characteristics that we associate with childhood, trust, presence, transparency, the willingness to be carried by life and guided by powers beyond its control, are the very same qualities that we value as seekers on the spiritual path. Now, curiosity is the key to beginner's wisdom. Curiosity keeps you focused on the present moment and buoys your spirit in times of pain. You may have had that experience yourself when you're going through something really hard, devastating ending or tragic loss. While at the same time, there's a part of you that's curious about what's happening, that's alert, that's alive, even while you're suffering. This curiosity doesn't make your pain go away, and it doesn't deny the impact of your feelings. What it does is stimulates attention that helps you draw insight and wisdom from what's taking place. Curiosity is the great ally that spurs you on to growth and learning. You come to view endings and pain and the cycles of time not as your enemies, not as mistakes or failures, but as invitations to heal, as opportunities to relax your grip in those places where you're caught or you're clinging. Curiosity expands the mind and creates space for things to be as they are. I had an amazing lesson in the power of spiritual curiosity. A couple of years ago, my dearest friend was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. This diagnosis came out of nowhere. Robert was the picture of health. He'd been certified as a yoga teacher a couple of weeks before. And then suddenly, during dinner one night, he had a little pain in his lower back. And he went to the doctor and was told that he had fourth stage metastatic cancer, and then he needed to go home and get his affairs in order. Now, the news was catastrophic, of course, for all of us. But even though Robert was devastated and absolutely did not want to die, there was something else happening in him as well. As his body started to decline, he also became intensely curious about what was happening to him. Robert was determined to live as fully as possible in the time he had left. And he didn't want to miss out on this time in a trance of victimization. For a person like him, who'd spent his life as a seeker, viewing himself as a victim at the end would have been worse almost than dying itself. In the 12 weeks before Robert's diagnosis and his passing, he continued to seek out healing, even though he knew that his body couldn't be cured. For him, healing came through learning, continuing to wake up as a human being, to stay curious about his existence. Watching this process was a revelation for me, because there was no looking back. There was no anger. There was no regret. There was no time wasted on why me. Instead, Robert met his death in the same way that he had lived, with gratitude. And he turned his final days into a celebration. 2 weeks before he died, he insisted on throwing himself this huge birthday bash, even though we couldn't believe he was going to have the energy to do it. But he did. And in fact, in that room of 100 people, he seemed like the least grieving of all. And when the end finally came, Robert was surrounded by friends. He was in his own bed. There wasn't any struggle. And the last thing he said before he closed his eyes was, "I'm free." Now, curiosity had helped Robert toward courage as he approached the end of his life. And even though death is the most extreme example, we face endings every day. Disappointments, breakages, changes of plan, reasons to give up or be afraid. But the question is, are we able to stay curious when things come to an end? Can we surrender to the larger scheme of our existence? Can we open our heart and our mind when loss happens and stay curious about the process? Or do we shut down and withdraw and blame and judge and resent and become our own enemies, fighting the facts of our changing lives? Are we able to see that every end really is a beginning? Or do we rage against mystery even as it's unfolding? These are really important questions for all of us to ask as we move through our own inevitable changes. The next practice that I would like to talk about is constructive grieving. Constructive grief. Nobody can move forward without dropping their ballast. The things that hold them down, the things that fill them up, the things that keep them stuck. No one can experience the fullness of being without allowing themselves to grieve, feeling the full impact of their losses, mourning the endings that affect them the most, and then making space for the new to enter in. Until you spill your grief, you can't be refilled. And there are spiritual boons and insights that only come to us in moments of emptiness, when there's space for them to fill. It's not that pain disappears. Anyone who's experienced life-changing grief will tell you that loss never passes completely. Grief for our loved ones comes and goes as long as we're here. But when you allow yourself to express your grief, you activate the heart that's gone undercover. In your willingness to experience your pain, you claim your right to the entire spectrum of human experience and emotion. Grieving is critical and ultimately constructive, provided that we don't get stuck in self-pity. Because self-pity is a lot easier to feel than grief. Self-pity comes kind of swaddled in anger and blame. Grief is much more raw and direct. Once we move past our egotism, including the question of why me, we enter into a much more tender and generous relationship with our own hard experience. We can allow the full sadness of life to be there without drowning out our compassion or our wisdom. There's a wonderful Sufi saying I've always loved about self-pity. Quote, "Overcome any bitterness that may have come because you were not up to the magnitude of the pain that was entrusted to you. Like the mother of the world who carries the pain of the world in her heart, each of us is part of her heart and is therefore endowed with a certain measure of cosmic pain. You are sharing in the totality of that pain. You are called upon to meet it in joy instead of self-pity." Joy instead of self-pity. That really is the point. Spiritual joy isn't fatuous, it's not naive. In fact, it can only arise once you've grieved the sadness that's inherent in living in a mortal human body. Robert grieved a lot as he dropped his own ballast. And this emptying is what allowed him to keep expanding. Grief has a sacred cleansing quality that ennobles us in times of loss, and can also ultimately be dynamic in the sense that grief shifts things. Grief shares the same root as gravitation. It has heft, it has weight, and it can move us toward wisdom and toward deeper healing by showing us what no longer matters to us. Okay? By turning up the heat a little bit in terms of living the lives we truly want to live and being ourselves. And finally, this brings us to the complex question of hope and how hope affects us in times of loss. Even though spiritual purists will tell you that hope is an illusion, I've always found this to be kind of a harsh, unhelpful position. Because in the absence of physical evidence, the soul survives on hope. It's not the naive kind of hope that everything will turn out just fine, we'll get just what we want and live happily ever after. It's the hope, which is really akin to faith, the hope that arises in darkness and moves us forward. Hope preserves a space in the shrinking mind for possibility. Even when we lose hope for a particular outcome, we can feel hope. For it's the force of hope itself, right? It's hope for the force of life and the coming of new beginnings. This kind of hope has a metaphysical power. It's the breeze that carries us through times of unknowing and times of extreme change. Stan Rice describes this force in a poem that I love. He writes, I was lost and sang my broken down songs in the hell of the hour. Then in my heart moved an oar, and I was found by a breeze from a door in the sea of forms, and was rowed to the cherry trees on the shore. That's what it feels like sometimes when we've given up everything, everything's been taken away from us. And then mysteriously, something happens, and we are moved forward by a power that transcends us, that's bigger than we are. Now, fixated hope, though, is really a problem, because when we attach ourselves to a single outcome, it's easy to become the hostage of hope, and to get imprisoned by optimism and entrap ourselves through inflexible craving for a premeditated result. Having seen a lot of people go through the dying process, I can tell you that there's almost nothing more painful than the kind of person who is trapped in this unreasonable, impossible optimism and will not let any sort of true feeling that doesn't live up to that optimism out in the open. They become more and more rigid, more and more terrified, more and more shut down. Hope like that blocks our progress because it stresses personal will over the will of God or life. Fixated hope is what the Tibetan teacher Pema Chodron is warning against when she describes hope as the flip side of fear. This is how Pema describes it. Quote, only by discovering ease with uncertainty, poise amidst shakiness, learning to stay with the broken heart and the rumbling stomach, can we truly be happy. In the world of hope and fear, we always have to change what is. But when we allow ourselves to feel uncertainty, disappointment, shock, embarrassment, we discover a mind that is clear, unbiased, and fresh. And that's exactly the point. In this fresh, unbiased, clear state of mind, where hope isn't fixated but universal, we don't say that we need this or that to be happy, only that life itself is worth sticking around for. That regardless of what happens to us, existence has interest and value to us. This universal, unattached hope is a source of strength and vitality. It makes us resilient, it makes us curious, and it makes us brave. We become game for life, for better or for worse. And this gameness, this volition, becomes a springboard that helps us start over when we think we don't have it in us. It reminds us that life isn't really a circle, endlessly repeating itself, but is a lot more like a figure eight, an infinity sign, that's forever circulating energy back into itself and into us. So curiosity, constructive grieving, and hope are ways that we can keep the channels clear and maximize our spiritual progress. They've helped me tremendously in my own life. And I encourage anyone who has resistance to change, which I would think would be most people, to look more deeply into curiosity and constructive grieving and unattached hope, hope that's akin to faith in the power of life to recreate itself and move us forward into the unknown.